Our New Testament reading this morning comes to us from not Paul's letter, but the letter to the church, the Hebrews. Listen for the word of God as it comes to us from chapter 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith he received power of procreation, even though he was too old and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and as innumerable as the grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, He has prepared a city for them. May God add a blessing to this reading of the Word. You will remember last week when I spoke to the children, I had my friend Tigey, one of my oldest friends in the world. He came from Cedar Point. He was won by one of my sister's boyfriends. She brought him home and gave him as a gift to me. And he has been my companion. I won't say constant, but he's been my companion ever since. I talked to the children last week about having faith as being the ability to trust. And I used this as an example, and I told them about when I was a child, and it was true that I had nightmares and I was afraid of the dark, that it helped me to clutch to Tigey and to suck on his tail. You can still see that he has no fur there. And to finger this tag that used to say what he was made of, but now it's just tatters because I fingered him and I held on to him, I hugged him, and he made me feel safe. But if you picture me as a little boy hugging Tigey, being afraid of the dark, pulling the covers over my head, you're picturing a human being in a fetal position, curled up against whatever dangers they may be, and taking comfort from whatever he can in order to survive the fear and the anxiety of everyday living. For a little boy, those anxieties are one thing. For grown-ups, they are another. But anxiety is anxiety. And while this sense of comfort is a piece of what we mean by faith, that is, the trusting of God in those times when we're tired and when we're afraid and when we're anxious, that is a piece of the definition of what faith is. We are not called to be human beings curled up under the covers with the nightlight on, hugging our godlike stuffed animal or our stuffed God for comfort. That is not what we are called to be or to do. Both of our scripture readings this morning paint a picture, and they both deal with an important figure who is mostly important to us and for us because of the nature and the shape and the texture of his faith. And that person is Abraham. Abraham and his wife Sarah, or as they were known in the very beginning, Abram and Sarai. Because they didn't get the names Abraham and Sarah until later, until they began to take on the identity which God had waiting for them. So in the beginning, they were Abram and Sarai. And in the story, Abram is the first person to have a relationship with God. Now, there was Adam and Eve, and there was Cain and Abel, and there was Noah, and there was the folks in Babel, and all those folks. But they're mythical figures. They exist in the time before history. Their stories kind of exist outside of time. But in a very real sense, Abraham is different. He is the first of the characters in the Old Testament who are actually part of the timeline that we are part of. And it is from Abraham and Sarah that God determines to build a people for himself. A people who will be, as Isaiah says, a light to the world, to all the other peoples. It is from Abraham that God determines that he will begin to reach out into the world and touch human beings and invite them into relationship with him. He and Sarah are the beginning. They're the kernel. And when God comes to Abram the first time and talks to him, the thing you need to understand about that story is that Abram doesn't know who he is. He's never met this God before. He's living in Ur of the Chaldees with his father-in-law, Terah. And they're worshiping their gods, the Mesopotamian gods. In the midst of this context, this God speaks to Abram and he says, well, first they move to Haran, and then in Haran, this God speaks to Abram, and he says, Abram, I want you to take your wife Sarah, and I want you to take all of your servants and all of your livestock and everything that you own, and I want you to set out across what is a really terrible and dangerous wilderness, because I'm going to take you to a promised land that you've never seen, that you've never heard tell of, but I have it in mind for you, and I want you to follow me. And Abram has no experience of this God on which to draw with regard to this God's faithfulness. And Abram does the most amazing thing. He packs up all his stuff. He gets his family organized, and he sets out on a dangerous journey to receive this promise, which has been made to him by a God with whom he has no history. I mean, my parents taught me about God early in my life, and I've been practicing the art of trusting God all my life, and I still only have just a little bit of a hang of that experience and that process. I have lots of experience of God blessing me when I moved off in unexpected and unknown directions. I have that experience. Abram didn't, and yet he followed. And that is a key kernel of what the definition of faith is. Sometimes people think that faith is about belief. That is, I believe in God. Well, great. God believes in you too. That's fine. That's a first step. But that is like the same thing as jumping into a pool. Doesn't mean you're not going to drown. Believing in God is just the tiniest beginning of faith. Believing is not faith. The second aspect of faith is what we discussed with the children last year, and it's one of the first things that we're introduced to by our parents about our life with God, and that is trust. We trust that God is with us, and that God will be with us and help us to get through the difficult times and to appreciate the good times, and will help us and lead us in the directions we need to go. Trust is the second piece, but as we said, it's not about hunkering down under the covers in a fetal position, hoping nothing bad will happen to us. The third piece of the understanding of what faith is stepping out, is going to places that you cannot see before you leave, in the way that Abraham and Sarah have stepped out into the wilderness, not having seen the land of Canaan before, not having ever experienced the faithfulness or the unfaithfulness of this God they never talked to before. Faith is the ability and the willingness to step out. You could say that faith, fully understood, is the willingness to step out in trust. You could say that faith is trust on the move. Faith is trust that is going somewhere, that is heading towards something, that is sure that that destination is there and that it will be what it is advertised to be. And that the one who has called us out onto this journey, the one who has said to you, throw off the blankets, the one who has said to you, let go of Taigi's tail, the one who has said to you, get out of your bed and step out into the darkness. Faith is the understanding and the willingness to believe and to accept and to count on the fact that that God will not only lead you to the place that He promises to lead you, but that He will be with you every moment of every day. About 10 or 11, 12 years, I forget now, but some number of years ago, more than a decade, Carol and I were living in a fairly small house with 3 boys who were now teenagers. And while that house was workable for us when they were elementary school kids, it was too small for us. There was no place for them to bring their friends, which was really something that we wanted. My parents, her parents, always had the philosophy that the best way to know what your kids were doing is if they were doing it there, and the way they did that was to make our house a welcoming place for our friends to be, and we wanted that for our children. So we decided to build a house. We found a design that we really liked and were excited about that would work for us. Carol's mom was beginning her walk with Alzheimer's, and we were going to have her live with us for a while. Carol's brother was going to move up from Florida. He was going to have an apartment in the basement, so we were building this house. And one of the things that we did was we watched it being built. Like every day, I couldn't keep myself. You know, the church where I worked was right across the street pretty much. And I kept going over there and kind of standing next to the big hole in the ground. Standing in the cement basement after it was poured. Standing on the floors once they were built in place. And imagining this house and what it was going to be like. And some days Carol would join me there, and even some days all the boys would come, and we would say, against this wall, the piano will be, and then the couch will be here, and the chair will be here, and the dining room table will be here, and we'll have this big island in the kitchen, and these things will happen in this space. Anybody built a house and done that, what I'm expecting, There's a sense in which, we were pointing at that wall, and it wasn't a wall. When we first started doing that, there wasn't anything there, and then there was just a thing on which a wall would be built. And then there were just 2x4s, But all the while, that wall was there. It was real. And the space that it would define for us was real. And the relationships that would happen inside this space, the parties that we would have, the family gatherings, the Christmases, the Thanksgivings, and so forth, they were already real in our imagination and in our longing because we wanted so much for this space. And in a very real way, what we were doing by being in that space and by imagining and by giving voice to our longing for that space and by envisioning what that space would be, we were creating it. I mean, there was an architect. There were builders. They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were going to do. But we were in the midst of it. That home was real before it was built. It was made real by our imagining, by our envisioning, by our love together, by our faith that it was a reality that was in the making. We were, by our anticipation, by our longing, by our envisioning, we were creating a space so that it was, in a very weird way, both real and not real. It was both a fantasy and a reality in that time of building. But here's the other thing that was happening at the same time that our anticipation and our longing was causing it to be shaped in a certain way. The realities of the design of that building were also shaping our vision, our hopes for our family, so that we were shaping that space at the same time that that space was beginning to shape us. And the family that we were in the 10 years and have been in the 10 years since that house was finished and we moved into it, that family that we have been was in many ways shaped by the nature of that space. The parties we had and the gatherings that we've had and the family that we've been able to bring from all around the country to spend days together because we had that much room. All of those things were shaped by that space. And in that time of building, remember, that shaping was already taking place, that mutual shaping, even before it was real. I want to suggest to you that's a really critical piece of what we mean when we talk about faith. In Hebrews, the letter writer says that Abraham knew already that there was this space that God had provided before he ever went there. He began to envision himself there. Before he ever had any children, he began to envision the nation that God would build from him and Sarah. Before it was real, it was already real. And the reason for that is because he and Sarah are willing to lean into the future. Because they exercise faith as trust in motion. That space already existed. The nation that would come to be because of them already existed. And if you follow the story of Abraham over time, you realize that it's a long time before Sarah conceives and has the first child. In fact, the passage that we read is God making the promise of a nation coming from him and promising that he will be his God and his shield. And Abraham says in a weak moment, very plaintively, he says, God, what will you give me? Because everything I have is going to Eliezer, my slave, when I die. That's sort of a weak moment for him, a tender and vulnerable moment for him, in which God says, don't worry. What you have, what I'm giving to you, will pass to somebody who is your own child. And your offspring will be as many as the stars in the heavens and the sands on the beach. And somehow, Abraham is able to believe God. he's able to continue walking into the future with the certainty that God will meet him there. He looks forward to a reality, to a home which he knows God has already built, and so it already exists at the same time that it already doesn't exist, and he can live in the midst of that. And the writer of Hebrews looks at that experience of Abraham and says that is the key to who he was and why he was important, because he believes that God has already built the house in which God intends for him to live. So it is with us. And what the writer of Hebrews is trying to encourage us to do is to step out into the future that God has envisioned. To step into and to begin to live in the world which is God's intention for the world, even before that world exists. We live in a world that's full of murder and meanness and brutality and poverty and fear and anxiety. But God is already constructing, is already building the world that is different from that. The world in which we live is not the world God intends, nor is it the way or the shape that the world will finally be in. God is already in our midst, building that new house for us to live in. Building that new city built on foundations. We can't see it, and yet we can see it. It's not yet real, and yet it is real. And the way that we do that is to live in it, to begin to imagine it, to begin to long for it, to begin to anticipate it, to begin to live and to behave as though that reality were already real, were already here. And in our longing and in our anticipation, and in our willingness to step forward and trust God to be there when we arrive, we shape the future in the shape that God intends for it to be. And here's the thing, as we step into it, God is also shaping us to fit in the world that he intends. Shaping us to be the people that he intends for us to be. So faith is not just about trusting God to protect us from the bad things because we're scared of the dark. Faith is finding the courage to step into a future that is not yet entirely real, and yet that we know is going to be real. And that by our stepping, God is going to make it real. And by our stepping and our trusting and our willingness to take risks, God is going to shape us into a new reality as well. Christ, his death, his resurrection, is at the center of the world we live in, and it is shaking things up. It is changing everything, including us. Our willingness to step out as Abraham did in faith is a piece of how God will accomplish what God intends, both for the world and for us. So no more cowering under the blankets and clutching Tigey under our arms. We're throwing off the covers. We're tucking Tigey in by himself because he's precious. But we're heading out on the journey that God calls us to. Thanks be to God.